Welcome to my channel. And before we begin, I want you to imagine something that may sound impossible. What if the biggest enemy standing between you and your dream is not your lack of intelligence, not your lack of talent, not your lack of opportunities, but a voice inside your own mind that has been quietly convincing you that you will fail? What if every opportunity you have avoided, every exam you have feared, every English sentence you have swallowed before speaking, and every dream you have postponed was never truly impossible, but simply buried beneath the constant noise of your own thoughts? This is the story of Daniel, a brilliant young student who had everything necessary to succeed except one thing. He did not trust himself. From the outside, Daniel looked like the kind of student every teacher admired. He was intelligent, curious, hardworking, and capable of understanding difficult subjects faster than many of his classmates. When a teacher explained something once, Daniel often understood it immediately. When his friends struggled with a difficult question, they would sometimes come to him for help. His notebooks were organized, his assignments were usually complete, and everyone around him believed that he had a bright future waiting for him. But nobody knew what happened inside his mind whenever he stood alone. Nobody knew that behind his intelligence was a constant battle that he fought every single day. Whenever an opportunity appeared, a quiet voice immediately appeared inside his head. You will fail. You are not ready. Someone else is better than you. Do not try because people will laugh when you make a mistake. At first, Daniel believed these thoughts were simply normal worries, but over time, they became stronger. They followed him into classrooms, exam halls, conversations, and even his dreams. The strange thing was that Daniel's biggest fear was not failure itself. His biggest fear was the possibility of discovering that the negative voice might be right. One Monday morning, Daniel received news that an important examination was approaching. It was one of the most important exams of his academic year, and he had already spent weeks preparing for it. He had studied every evening, reviewed his notes, practiced difficult questions, and even created a schedule to make sure he was ready. If preparation alone determined success, Daniel should have felt confident, but confidence was exactly what he could not find. The night before the examination, Daniel sat at his desk surrounded by books and notes. He looked at everything he had studied, yet instead of feeling prepared, his mind began creating frightening possibilities. What if I forget everything? What if the questions are too difficult? What if I fail? What if everyone realizes I am not as intelligent as they think? Daniel closed his book and tried to sleep, but his mind refused to become quiet. The next morning, he entered the examination hall with a heavy feeling in his chest. He sat down, took a deep breath, and waited for the paper. When the examiner finally placed the question sheet in front of him, something unexpected happened. Daniel looked at the first question, and suddenly his mind went completely blank. He knew the answer. He had practiced a similar question many times, yet the answer seemed to disappear from his memory. He looked at the second question, and the same thing happened. His heart started beating faster, his hands became cold, the voice inside his mind became louder. See? You knew this would happen. You are going to fail. Daniel tried to fight the fear, but the more he fought it, the stronger it became. He spent precious minutes staring at the paper, watching other students write while he remained frozen. Eventually, he forced himself to begin. He completed the examination, but he knew immediately that he had not performed at the level he was capable of achieving. When the results arrived, his fears seemed to become reality. His score was much lower than expected. His teachers were surprised. His friends were surprised. Even Daniel was surprised. But instead of asking what had gone wrong, he immediately accepted the negative explanation his mind offered him. Maybe I am not actually intelligent. Maybe everyone was wrong about me. Maybe I will never become successful. That night, Daniel sat alone in his room, staring at the result sheet. The paper in his hand was only a collection of numbers, but to Daniel, it felt like a final judgment on his entire future. He forgot all the hours he had studied. He forgot the difficult questions he had previously solved. He forgot every time he had helped his classmates. One disappointing result had become proof, at least in his mind, that he was a failure. From that day forward, the voice inside his head became even stronger. Whenever Daniel considered trying something new, it whispered, "You will fail." Whenever he thought about speaking English, it warned him, "People will laugh at your mistakes." Whenever he prepared for another exam, it reminded him, "Last time you failed, and you will fail again." Daniel began avoiding opportunities before they could even become opportunities. One afternoon, during a college activity, a teacher asked the students to speak briefly in English about their future goals. Daniel knew exactly what he wanted to say. He had practiced English many times privately. He understood the words, he knew the grammar. But when the teacher looked toward him and asked him to speak, Daniel immediately lowered his eyes. His heart started beating faster. He imagined himself making a mistake. He imagined everyone laughing. He imagined forgetting a simple sentence. So he stayed silent. Another student answered instead, and the class moved on. Nobody knew how much that moment hurt Daniel. He walked home that day feeling disappointed in himself. He had not failed because he lacked knowledge. He had failed because fear had convinced him not to try. That evening, Daniel looked at himself in the mirror and wondered how long he could continue living this way. Outside, he was pretending to be confident. Inside, he was constantly preparing for failure. He realized that he had become an expert at imagining everything that could go wrong. Before every decision, he created a disaster in his mind. Before every opportunity, he predicted rejection. Before every conversation, he imagined embarrassment. Before every exam, he imagined failure. And slowly, Daniel began to understand something frightening. His life was not being controlled by reality. It was being controlled by the stories his mind created about reality. The next day, something happened that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. After class, one of his teachers noticed that Daniel seemed unusually quiet. The teacher had known him for a long time and understood that Daniel was capable of much more than he allowed himself to show. Instead of giving him another lecture about studying harder, the teacher asked him a simple question. "Daniel, do you control your thoughts, or do your thoughts control you?" Daniel did not know how to answer. The question followed him home. That night, for the first time, he began observing his own mind. He noticed something he had never consciously noticed before. Every time something happened, his mind immediately searched for the worst possible outcome. If someone did not reply to his message, he assumed they were angry with him. If a teacher asked him a question, he assumed he would answer incorrectly. If he made a small mistake, he believed everyone would remember it forever. If he imagined his future, he saw himself failing. Daniel suddenly realized that his mind had developed a habit of turning uncertainty into fear. The thought was powerful, but a thought was still only a thought. The next morning, his teacher gave him a strange challenge. "Try something simple," the teacher said. "Every morning, sit quietly for 5 minutes. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and observe whatever thoughts appear. Do not fight them. Do not believe them. Just watch them." Daniel almost laughed. 5 minutes? That sounds easy. But the next morning, he discovered that 5 minutes could feel like an eternity when you were forced to sit alone with your own mind. He closed his eyes and took a breath. Within seconds, his thoughts began racing. "You are wasting your time. You have too much work. What if this does not help? You cannot even meditate properly." Daniel opened his eyes after what felt like 5 minutes, only to discover that less than 1 minute had passed. He was frustrated. He thought meditation was supposed to make the mind peaceful, but his mind seemed louder than ever. For a moment, he wanted to quit. Then he remembered his teacher's words. "Do not fight the thoughts. Do not believe them. Just observe them." Daniel closed his eyes again. Another thought appeared. "I cannot meditate." But this time, something inside him changed. Instead of immediately accepting the thought as truth, Daniel asked himself a question he had never asked before. Is this a fact, or is this just another thought? The question was simple, but it opened a door inside his mind. Daniel realized that if his mind could say, "You will fail," then perhaps he did not have to believe it. If his mind could say, You are not good enough. Perhaps that was not a fact either. Maybe these thoughts were created by fear, insecurity, old experiences, and painful memories. Maybe the voice inside his head was not a prophet predicting his future. Maybe it was simply a voice he had trained himself to listen to. That realization did not change Daniel's life in one morning, but it changed the direction of his life. From that day forward, Daniel continued sitting for 5 minutes every morning. Some days were peaceful, other days were difficult. Sometimes his mind was quiet for a few seconds, sometimes hundreds of thoughts appeared. But he stopped judging himself. Whenever a thought came, he noticed it. Whenever fear appeared, he breathed. Whenever his mind wandered into the past or future, he gently returned to the present moment. Slowly, Daniel began discovering something extraordinary. He was not his thoughts. He was the person who could observe his thoughts. And if he could observe them, he could choose whether to follow them. This was the beginning of a transformation Daniel could not yet see. His negative voice had not disappeared. His fear had not vanished. His problems had not magically become easier. But for the first time in his life, Daniel had discovered a space between a thought and his reaction. And inside that small space was something he had been searching for all along: freedom. The next morning, Daniel woke up before his alarm. For a few seconds, he simply stared at the ceiling, listening to the quietness of the room. Then, he remembered the promise he had made to himself. 5 minutes. He sat on the edge of his bed, placed his feet on the floor, and closed his eyes. At first, his mind immediately returned to the same familiar places: his upcoming assignments, his exam results, his fear of speaking English, the embarrassing moment in class, the possibility of failing again. But this time, Daniel did something different. He did not argue with the thoughts. He did not try to force them away. He simply noticed them and returned his attention to his breathing. One thought came, and he watched it. Another appeared, and he let it pass. Then another arrived, telling him that he was wasting time. Daniel almost smiled. He recognized the voice now. It was the same voice that had been controlling him for years. But this morning, he did not obey it. He finished his 5 minutes. It was not a dramatic victory. Nobody applauded. Nothing around him changed. Yet something inside him had changed. Daniel had kept a promise to himself. He had spent 5 minutes without allowing his thoughts to control his actions. And that small victory became the beginning of a new habit. Every morning, before touching his phone, Daniel meditated for 5 minutes. He did not expect perfection. He simply wanted to practice awareness. Some mornings he felt calm. Other mornings his mind was restless. Sometimes he wanted to quit. Sometimes he wondered if 5 minutes could really change anything. But he continued. He slowly began to understand that meditation was not about becoming a person who never had negative thoughts. It was about becoming a person who did not automatically believe every negative thought. A few days later, his mind tested him again. Daniel had an important assignment due, and instead of starting immediately, he felt the familiar urge to escape. His phone was lying beside him. He picked it up, planning to check one message. One message became a video. One video became another. Soon, almost an hour had disappeared. Daniel suddenly realized what he was doing. The old Daniel would have continued scrolling and then blamed himself at night, but this time, he put the phone down. He closed his eyes for 5 minutes and breathed. He noticed the frustration inside him. He noticed the voice saying, "You always do this. You will never change." But instead of believing the voice, Daniel observed it. Then he opened his eyes, placed the phone in another room, and began his assignment. It was a small decision, but it showed him that awareness could create action. The next week, Daniel experienced his first real test. During an English class, the teacher asked a simple question. Daniel knew the answer. He understood exactly what he wanted to say, but the old fear appeared immediately. What if you pronounce something incorrectly? What if they laugh? What if you sound stupid? His heart began beating faster. For a moment, he considered looking down like he had done before. Then, he remembered his 5 minutes. He remembered that a thought was not a command. Fear was present, but fear did not have to make the decision. Daniel slowly raised his hand. The teacher looked at him and invited him to answer. Daniel stood up and began speaking. His voice was not perfect, his grammar was not perfect, and halfway through his answer, he made a small mistake. A few students laughed. The old Daniel would have felt destroyed. He would have sat down, replayed the moment for days, and perhaps stopped speaking English completely. But this time, Daniel took a breath. He finished his sentence and sat down. His heart was still beating quickly, but something unexpected happened. He did not feel destroyed. He felt proud. Not because his English had been perfect, but because he had done something his fear had told him he could not do. He had spoken anyway. That evening, Daniel sat for his 5-minute meditation. The memory of the classroom returned. His mind immediately began criticizing him. You sounded foolish. Everyone noticed your mistake. You should never speak again. But Daniel listened carefully. Then he asked himself the same question. Is this a fact, or is this just a thought? He realized that the facts were simple. He had made one mistake. Some students had laughed. He had finished speaking. That was all. Everything else was a story his mind had created. Daniel began to see the difference between an event and the meaning he gave to that event. The mistake was real. The shame was optional. The laughter was real. The belief that he was incapable was not. This understanding slowly changed the way Daniel viewed failure. He had spent years believing that failure was evidence of weakness. Now, he began seeing failure as information. A mistake could show him what to practice. A poor exam result could show him where he needed improvement. A difficult conversation could teach him what he needed to learn. Failure was no longer a final judgment. It was feedback. This new way of thinking gave Daniel permission to practice without demanding perfection. He started speaking English every day, even when nobody was listening. He stood in front of his mirror and introduced himself. He described his day. He read short passages aloud. He recorded his voice and listened to himself. At first, hearing his own English made him uncomfortable. He noticed every mistake. But instead of attacking himself, he treated each mistake as a lesson. His goal was no longer to speak perfect English. His goal was to become brave enough to speak despite imperfection. Slowly, something began to happen. Daniel's confidence did not arrive like a sudden explosion. It grew quietly, one small action at a time. Every time he spoke, he became less afraid. Every time he made a mistake and survived it, his fear became weaker. Every time he completed his 5-minute meditation, he became more aware of his thoughts. And every time he noticed a negative thought without obeying it, he became stronger. But transformation is never a straight line. Just when Daniel thought he was finally changing, his old mind returned. It happened on a difficult Monday morning. Daniel had slept badly, his assignments were incomplete, and an important test was approaching. He woke up feeling exhausted. The first thought that entered his mind was, I cannot do this anymore. Then another followed. Maybe I should stop trying. Maybe my dreams are too big for me. Daniel felt the familiar heaviness returning. For several minutes, he sat on his bed staring at his phone. He wanted to escape. He wanted to scroll through social media and forget everything. The temptation was powerful. But then Daniel remembered how quickly his old life had returned whenever he stopped paying attention. He placed the phone face down. He sat quietly. 5 minutes. That was all he needed to do. His mind protested immediately. This will not solve anything. You have too many problems. You are wasting time. But Daniel had learned something important. He did not need to solve his entire life in 5 minutes. He only needed to create enough space to choose his next action. He breathed slowly. He noticed his fear. He noticed his exhaustion. He noticed his desire to escape. Then he asked himself, what is actually happening right now? The answer was simple. He was tired. He had work to complete. He had a test coming. He was afraid. But none of those facts meant that his future was ruined. None of them meant he should give up. When the 5 minutes ended, Daniel opened his eyes. His problems were still there, but his relationship with those problems had changed. Instead of thinking, everything is impossible, he thought, I have one task to complete. Instead of thinking, I will fail, he thought. I can prepare. Instead of thinking, I am not good enough, he thought, I am still learning. Daniel picked up his notebook and began working. That day, he did not become a completely different person. He still felt stress. He still felt fear. But he had learned how to continue while feeling those emotions. That was a much deeper form of strength. Weeks passed, and Daniel continued his routine: 5 minutes of meditation every morning, English practice every day, focused study sessions without his phone. Slowly, his teachers began noticing a difference. Daniel was participating more. He was asking questions. He was willing to make mistakes. His grades began improving, not because he had suddenly become more intelligent, but because his mind was no longer wasting so much energy fighting imaginary disasters. He could finally use his intelligence instead of constantly defending himself from fear. Then, one afternoon, Daniel received an unexpected message from his college. An important English presentation was being organized, and selected students would have the opportunity to present in front of hundreds of people. Daniel read the message twice. His heart immediately began beating faster. The old voice returned. Do not do it. You will forget everything. You will embarrass yourself. Someone else is better. Daniel stared at the screen. This was exactly the kind of opportunity he had avoided his entire life. And now it was standing directly in front of him. He could reject it. Nobody would blame him. He could tell himself that he was not ready. He could choose the safety of his comfort zone. But Daniel knew something now that he had not known before. If he always obeyed fear, his life would never become larger than his fear. He closed his eyes and took a slow breath. Then he asked himself one question. If I say no because I am afraid, will I be proud of that decision 5 years from now? The answer came quietly. No. Daniel looked at the application form. His hands were shaking slightly. His mind was creating every possible disaster. Yet, beneath all that noise, another voice had begun to grow. It was quieter than fear, but stronger than before. You do not need to know exactly how this will end. You only need to choose whether you are willing to try. Daniel took a deep breath and clicked the button. He accepted the opportunity, and with that single decision, he stepped into the most frightening chapter of his life. He did not know it yet, but the real battle would not happen on the stage. It would happen the night before, when his old mind would return with more power than ever, demanding that he run away before anyone could see him fail. The night before the presentation, Daniel discovered that accepting the opportunity had been easier than preparing to face it. The moment he returned home, the confidence he had felt earlier began disappearing. He placed his bag beside his desk, opened his laptop, and looked at the presentation slides. For a few seconds, everything seemed normal. Then his mind began its familiar attack. What if you forget your words? What if everyone notices your mistakes? What if your voice shakes? What if you stand there and your mind becomes completely blank? What if they laugh? What if this presentation proves that you are never as capable as everyone believed? Daniel tried to continue reading, but the words on the screen became difficult to process. His mind was no longer preparing for the presentation. It was preparing for disaster. He closed the laptop and walked around his room. He could feel his heart beating faster. His palms became sweaty. The fear was not coming from the stage itself because the stage was still hours away. The fear was coming from an imaginary future that existed only inside his mind. Daniel suddenly stopped walking. That realization felt strangely powerful. He had spent years suffering from events that had never happened. He had failed exams in his imagination before entering the exam hall. He had embarrassed himself in conversations before saying a single word. He had rejected opportunities before anyone else could reject him. He had already lived through hundreds of disasters that existed only in his thoughts. Daniel sat down. He remembered the question his teacher had asked him months ago. Do you control your thoughts, or do your thoughts control you? For the first time, Daniel understood why that question had stayed with him. His mind was trying to convince him that the future was already decided. But the future was not a fact. It was a possibility. And possibilities could change. Daniel closed his eyes and began his 5-minute meditation. At first, the fear was overwhelming. His mind showed him images of the presentation going wrong. He imagined forgetting every sentence. He imagined hundreds of people staring at him. He imagined walking away in embarrassment. But Daniel did not fight those images. He observed them. There is fear, he thought. There is another thought. There is another imagined disaster. He breathed slowly. Then he asked himself, is this happening right now? No. Right now, he was sitting safely in his room. The presentation had not started. Nobody was laughing. Nobody was judging him. The disaster existed only in his imagination. Daniel felt something inside him become quieter. He realized that his mind was not his enemy. It was simply trying to protect him from uncertainty. But protection could sometimes become a prison. His mind had learned that avoiding pain was safer than risking failure. Daniel had believed that voice for years. Now he had a choice. He could continue obeying it, or he could thank it for trying to protect him and still move forward. When the 5 minutes ended, Daniel opened his eyes. He did not suddenly feel fearless. That was not the goal. The fear was still there. But Daniel had become bigger than the fear. He opened his laptop again. This time, instead of trying to memorize every word perfectly, he focused on understanding his message. He practiced the opening. Then he practiced the middle. Then he practiced the ending. He made mistakes. He paused. He started again. He reminded himself that his goal was not perfection. His goal was communication. He wanted to share something useful, not prove that he was flawless. He practiced until midnight, then closed the laptop. Before sleeping, Daniel sat quietly for another 5 minutes. This time, his meditation was different. He was not asking his mind to remove fear. He was simply reminding himself that fear could exist without controlling him. The next morning arrived faster than he expected. Daniel woke up with a heavy feeling in his chest. For a moment, he considered pretending to be sick. He could send a message and say he was unable to attend. Nobody would know how afraid he really was. The opportunity could disappear, and he could return to his comfortable life. But Daniel knew the truth. If he ran away, the fear would become stronger. The next opportunity would feel even more frightening, and the one after that might never come because he would keep choosing safety over growth. He sat on his bed, 5 minutes. He closed his eyes. His thoughts arrived immediately. Do not go. You are not ready. You will fail. Daniel noticed each one. He did not argue. He did not say, I will definitely succeed. Instead, he said something more honest. Maybe I will make mistakes. Maybe I will feel afraid. Maybe the presentation will not be perfect. But I can still show up. That sentence changed everything. Daniel finally understood that courage did not mean believing that everything would go perfectly. Courage meant accepting that things might go wrong and deciding to move forward anyway. He finished his meditation, stood up, and prepared himself. At college, the atmosphere was completely different from an ordinary day. Students were moving around the auditorium. Teachers were organizing the event. The large stage stood at the front of the hall. Daniel looked at the rows of seats and immediately felt his old fear returning. Hundreds of people. His mind whispered, You are making a mistake. Daniel almost laughed because the voice sounded so familiar now. It had been with him for years, but now he could recognize it. He knew its patterns. Whenever something important appeared, it predicted disaster. Whenever success became possible, it reminded him of failure. Whenever he stepped outside his comfort zone, it tried to pull him back. Daniel took a deep breath. He did not need to destroy the voice. He only needed to stop letting it make every decision. One by one, other students went onto the stage. Daniel watched them. Some spoke confidently. Some made mistakes. One student forgot a sentence and paused. Another student mispronounced a word. Nothing terrible happened. The audience simply waited. Daniel realized that he had created an imaginary standard in which every speaker had to be perfect. But real people were not perfect. They paused, they stumbled, they corrected themselves. They continued. Then his name was called. For 1 second, Daniel could not move. His heart started racing. His hands became cold. The old voice screamed louder than ever. Sit down. Do not go. This is your last chance to avoid humiliation. Daniel looked toward the stage. Then he remembered something important. He had spent years waiting to feel ready, but perhaps readiness was not a feeling. Perhaps readiness was a decision. Daniel stood up. His legs felt weak as he walked toward the stage. Every step felt like a battle. He reached the microphone. Hundreds of faces looked back at him. For a moment, his mind became completely silent. This was the moment he had feared for years. Daniel took one slow breath, then another. He remembered his 5 minutes. He remembered all the mornings when his mind had wandered and he had gently brought it back. He realized that this moment was another meditation. The audience was his distraction. Fear was his thought. The stage was the present moment, and his job was simply to return to the next sentence. Daniel looked at the audience and began. His first words were quiet. His voice shook slightly, but the sentence came out. Then another, then another. He continued. After a few minutes, something unexpected happened. Daniel stopped thinking about himself. He stopped asking how he looked. He stopped wondering whether people were judging him. His attention moved toward the message he was sharing. And when his attention moved away from fear, fear began losing its power. Daniel spoke about his topic with genuine interest. He explained his ideas. He gave examples. He even smiled once when he made a small mistake. Instead of stopping, he corrected himself and continued. The audience did not turn against him. Nobody shouted that he was incapable. Nobody demanded perfection. They simply listened. When Daniel reached the final sentence, he felt something he had never expected to feel on a stage. Peace. Not complete peace. His heart was still beating quickly. His hands were still slightly nervous. But underneath the fear was a quiet confidence. He had faced himself. Daniel finished his presentation. For 1 second, the auditorium was silent. Then the audience applauded. Daniel stood there, almost unable to believe it. The applause was not the most important part. The most important thing had happened before the applause. He had discovered that the voice inside his head could be loud without being right. He had believed for years that confidence meant having no fear. Now he understood that confidence could mean something completely different. Confidence was trusting yourself enough to act while fear was present. After the presentation, several teachers approached Daniel. One of them congratulated him and told him that his message had been powerful because he spoke honestly. Another teacher asked him if he would be interested in joining a student communication program that worked with organizations and international participants. Daniel listened carefully. Then the teacher explained that the program required students to travel, speak English regularly, and participate in events with people from different countries. Daniel felt his heart drop. This was another opportunity, a bigger one. The old voice returned immediately. You are not ready. Your English is not perfect. You will embarrass yourself. You will be surrounded by people better than you. Daniel thanked the teacher and said he needed time to think. That evening, he returned home and sat alone in his room. He realized that life had a strange way of testing the lessons you thought you had learned. It was easy to say that you were no longer controlled by fear when the decision was small. But what happened when the opportunity could actually change your future? Daniel opened his notebook. Years earlier, he had written a simple sentence on the first page. I want to become someone who is not afraid to live. He stared at those words for a long time. He understood that his dream had never been about becoming perfect. It had been about becoming free. Free from the constant need to know that everything would work out. Free from the fear of judgment. Free from the belief that one mistake could define his entire identity. Daniel closed the notebook. Then he began to think about the opportunity. It was exactly the kind of decision that could take him into an unknown future. He would have to leave familiar routines. He would meet people he had never seen. He would have to speak English every day. He would probably make mistakes. He might feel uncomfortable. He might even fail. But there was another possibility. He might grow. He might discover abilities he had never known existed. He might meet people who changed his life. He might become the person he had always wanted to be. Daniel realized that fear was presenting only one possible future. It was showing him failure, embarrassment, and rejection. But fear was not showing him growth, friendship, achievement, or discovery. It was giving him only the worst case scenario and calling it the truth. Daniel smiled. He had learned to question his thoughts. So he asked himself the question again: is this fear a fact, or is it only a thought? The answer was clear. It was a thought. The next morning, Daniel returned to his teacher. He had made his decision. He would accept the opportunity. His teacher smiled and told him that he would need to prepare seriously. Daniel knew that. He also knew something else. Preparation did not mean he would never be afraid again. It meant he would learn how to move forward with fear beside him. The weeks that followed were challenging. Daniel practiced English every day. He listened to conversations. He read aloud. He recorded himself speaking. He made mistakes constantly. Sometimes his pronunciation was wrong. Sometimes he forgot words. Sometimes he became frustrated and wanted to quit. But every morning, he continued his 5-minute meditation. The practice had become more than a habit. It had become a reminder. Your thoughts are not commands. Your emotions are not permanent. Your fear is not your identity. Your future is not decided by your worst prediction. These lessons changed the way Daniel approached every challenge. When he struggled with English, he did not say, "I am stupid." He said, "I need more practice." When he made a mistake, he did not say, "I am a failure." He said, "I found something I can improve." When he felt afraid, he did not say, "I must stop." He said, "I can breathe and take the next step." Slowly, Daniel became someone his younger self would never have recognized. Not because he had become fearless, but because he had stopped treating fear as the leader of his life. Then the day of his departure arrived. Daniel stood at the station with his bag beside him. He looked around at the familiar streets and felt a strange mixture of excitement and sadness. He was leaving the environment where he had spent years fighting the same battles. But he knew that the real journey was not about going to another place. The real journey had already begun inside his mind. His teacher's question returned one final time. Do you control your thoughts, or do your thoughts control you? Daniel looked toward the road ahead. For the first time, he did not need an answer in words. His life was becoming the answer. The train began moving slowly, carrying Daniel toward a future he could not predict. He watched the familiar streets disappear behind him, and for the first time in his life, he felt something different from fear. He felt uncertainty, but uncertainty no longer looked like a warning. It looked like possibility. Daniel leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes. 5 minutes. He had started with 5 minutes, and now those 5 minutes had carried him farther than he ever imagined. He remembered the boy he had once been, the intelligent student who could answer difficult questions but could not trust his own answers. He remembered the exams where his mind went blank, the conversations he avoided, the opportunities he rejected, and the countless nights when he had allowed imaginary failures to become reasons for giving up. For years, Daniel had believed his biggest enemy was the world. He thought other people were judging him. Opportunities were too difficult, and circumstances were always against him. But now he understood that the hardest battle had never been outside. It had been inside his own mind. His mind had created predictions, and he had treated those predictions like facts. His mind had whispered that he would fail, and he had believed it before trying. His mind had told him that people would laugh, and he had stayed silent before speaking. His mind had warned him that the future was dangerous, and he had remained trapped in the comfort of the present. Meditation had not destroyed those thoughts. It had simply taught him to see them clearly. That difference changed everything. Daniel arrived in the new city with nervous excitement. The communication program was larger than he had imagined. Students from different backgrounds had gathered together, and many of them spoke English naturally. On the first day, Daniel listened to conversations around him and immediately felt his old insecurity returning. People spoke quickly. Some used expressions he did not understand. Others seemed confident and experienced. For a moment, the old voice returned. Look at them. They are better than you. You do not belong here. Daniel felt the familiar pressure in his chest. But then he remembered his practice. He took a slow breath. There is the thought again, he told himself. It is trying to protect me from embarrassment, but I do not have to believe it. Daniel walked into the room. He introduced himself. His English was not perfect. He paused several times. He forgot a word and had to explain it differently, but nobody rejected him. In fact, another student smiled and helped him find the word he was looking for. Daniel realized something important. The world was not as cruel as his mind had predicted. His fear had imagined judgment, but reality offered connection. His fear had imagined rejection, but reality offered help. His fear had imagined failure, but reality offered another chance to try. This happened again and again during the program. Every day, Daniel encountered situations that challenged him. Every day, his mind produced reasons to avoid them. And every day, Daniel practiced choosing his response. Sometimes he succeeded. Sometimes he still allowed fear to control him. But now, even when he failed, he noticed it. He did not turn one bad moment into an identity. If he avoided a conversation, he did not say, "I am hopeless." He simply recognized what had happened and tried again the next day. This was one of the biggest changes in Daniel's life. Before meditation, he had believed that progress meant never going backward. Now he understood that progress meant returning faster. A strong person was not someone who never became distracted. A strong person was someone who noticed the distraction and returned. A confident person was not someone who never felt nervous. A confident person was someone who noticed the nervousness and continued. A disciplined person was not someone who never felt lazy. A disciplined person was someone who felt lazy and still did what mattered. Daniel's 5-minute practice had taught him a principle that extended far beyond meditation. Life would always pull his attention away. Fear would always appear before important moments. Doubt would sometimes return. Negative thoughts would sometimes become loud. The goal was not to create a mind that never struggled. The goal was to create a person who knew how to return. Months passed. Daniel's English improved significantly. He became comfortable speaking with people from different countries. He started helping other students who were afraid to speak. Whenever someone apologized for making a mistake, Daniel smiled and said, "You do not need perfect English to communicate. You only need the courage to continue." Those words were not just advice. They came from his own experience. He knew what it felt like to have a sentence inside your mind, but be too afraid to say it. He knew what it felt like to hear laughter after making a mistake. He knew what it felt like to believe that one failure could define your entire future. And because he knew that pain, he could help others move through it. One afternoon, a younger student approached Daniel. The student told him that he was afraid of speaking English and that he always imagined people laughing at him. Daniel listened quietly. Then he asked the student a question. "When that thought appears, do you believe it immediately?" The student looked confused. Daniel smiled and explained that a thought could be observed without being obeyed. He told him about his 5-minute meditation practice. He explained that the purpose was not to stop thoughts, but to create space between the thought and the reaction. When your mind says you will fail, you do not have to answer "yes, I will." You can simply say, "That is a thought," then breathe, then decide what you want to do. The student listened carefully. Daniel could see something changing in his expression. Perhaps the student was hearing the same lesson Daniel had needed years earlier. You are not every thought that enters your mind. That evening, Daniel returned to his room and thought about how far he had come. He realized that transformation rarely feels dramatic while it is happening. There had been no single magical morning when Daniel woke up fearless. There had been no instant moment when every negative thought disappeared. His life had changed through hundreds of small decisions. 5 minutes of meditation, 1 page of English, 1 sentence spoken aloud, 1 mistake survived, 1 opportunity accepted, 1 fear faced, 1 negative thought questioned, 1 morning of starting again after a bad day. These actions had seemed insignificant at the time, but together they had redirected his entire future. Daniel opened his old notebook again. On the first page was the sentence he had written years ago. "I want to become someone who is not afraid to live." He read it slowly, then he smiled. He had once believed that becoming fearless was the destination. Now he understood that fearlessness was not the goal, freedom was. Freedom meant being able to feel fear without surrendering your decisions to it. Freedom meant being able to hear criticism without allowing it to destroy your identity. Freedom meant being able to make mistakes without believing that you were a mistake. Freedom meant trusting yourself enough to continue learning. Daniel closed the notebook. His journey was not finished. In fact, he knew there would always be new challenges. There would be difficult exams, important interviews, unfamiliar places, complicated relationships, and decisions that frightened him. His mind would continue producing negative thoughts, but now he had something he had never possessed before. He had awareness. He knew how to pause. He knew how to breathe. He knew how to observe. And most importantly, he knew how to choose. Years later, Daniel became successful in his career. People admired his communication skills, his confidence, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. They saw the person he had become, but very few knew about the student he had once been. They did not know how many opportunities he had avoided. They did not know how many nights he had spent fighting his own thoughts. They did not know that there had been a time when Daniel could not speak English in front of a classroom. They did not know that his mind had once convinced him he would never succeed. And they certainly did not know that the foundation of his transformation had begun with 5 quiet minutes. One day, Daniel was invited to speak to a group of students about confidence and personal growth. He stood on a stage looking at hundreds of young faces. For a moment, he remembered the first presentation that had changed his life. He remembered the shaking hands, the racing heart, the voice telling him to run away. He smiled because the same situation that once represented fear now represented freedom. Daniel began speaking. He told the students that confidence was not something you waited for. It was something you built through action. He told them that fear was not proof that they should stop. Sometimes fear was simply proof that something mattered. He told them that mistakes were not evidence of weakness. They were evidence that they were practicing something difficult. Then he shared the lesson that had changed his own life. Your mind will sometimes tell you things that sound completely true. It may tell you that you are not good enough. It may tell you that you will fail. It may tell you that everyone is judging you. But remember this, a thought is not a fact. You do not have to believe everything your mind says. The room became quiet. Daniel continued. I used to think I needed to defeat my negative thoughts before I could move forward. I was wrong. I did not need to defeat them. I needed to understand them. I needed to observe them. I needed to stop treating every thought as an instruction. Then he told them about the 5-minute meditation that had started everything. He explained how simple the practice had been. Sit down, breathe. Notice the thought, let it pass. Return to the breath. Repeat. It sounds small, Daniel said, but sometimes the smallest habit can change the direction of your entire life. After the speech, several students approached him. One wanted advice about exams, another wanted help with English. Someone else admitted that they were afraid of failing their family. Daniel listened to each person. He did not give them magical answers because he knew there were no magical answers. Instead, he encouraged them to begin with something small. Do not try to fix your entire life tonight, he told them. Choose one thing you can control. Maybe it is 5 minutes of meditation. Maybe it is 5 minutes of English practice. Maybe it is one conversation you have been avoiding. Maybe it is one application you are afraid to submit. Start small, but start. That night, Daniel returned home and sat quietly as he had done thousands of times before. He closed his eyes. His mind was still active. Thoughts appeared about work, family, the future, and responsibilities. Daniel smiled. Even after all these years, the mind was still the mind. It still created stories. It still worried. It still predicted problems. But Daniel no longer feared that. He had learned to let thoughts come and go. He breathed slowly. 5 minutes passed. Then he opened his eyes. Nothing dramatic had happened. The world had not changed. But Daniel knew something important. Peace was not the absence of noise. Peace was knowing that you did not have to follow every noise. That was the gift meditation had given him. It had not made his life perfect. It had made him capable of facing an imperfect life. It had not removed fear. It had taught him how to carry fear without allowing it to choose his direction. It had not made him immune to failure. It had taught him how to fail without losing himself. It had not given him a perfect mind. It had given him the ability to observe his mind, and that ability had changed everything. Daniel thought about the student he had once been. If he could speak to that younger version of himself, he would not tell him that everything would be easy. He would not promise that he would never fail again. He would not say that nobody would ever judge him. Instead, he would tell him something more valuable. You are going to hear a voice inside your mind that tells you to stop. It will sound convincing. It will tell you that you are not ready. It will remind you of every mistake you have ever made. It will show you every possible way things could go wrong. But listen carefully. That voice is not your destiny. It is only a voice. You can hear it without obeying it. And perhaps that was the greatest lesson Daniel had learned. The greatest battle of his life had never been against the world. It had been against the voice inside his own mind. For years, that voice had controlled his choices. It had decided which opportunities he accepted, which conversations he avoided, and how he interpreted every failure. But one day, Daniel had finally stopped running. He had sat quietly for 5 minutes and listened. And when he listened, he discovered something extraordinary. The voice was not always telling the truth. The thought that said he would fail was not a prophecy. The thought that said he was not good enough was not a fact. The thought that said everyone was judging him was not reality. They were thoughts, nothing more. And once Daniel understood that, he became free. His journey teaches us something powerful. You do not need to change your entire life in one day. You do not need to become fearless overnight. You do not need to have perfect confidence before taking your first step. You only need to create enough space between yourself and your thoughts to make one better decision. Maybe that decision is 5 minutes of silence. Maybe it is opening the book you have been avoiding. Maybe it is speaking one sentence in English. Maybe it is applying for an opportunity. Maybe it is walking onto a stage while your hands are shaking. Whatever your moment is, remember Daniel's story. Your mind may tell you that you cannot. It may tell you that you are too late. It may tell you that everyone else is better. It may tell you that failure will destroy you. But you do not have to believe every thought. Breathe, observe, question, then choose. Because your future is not created by the loudest thought in your mind. Your future is created by the actions you take after that thought appears. Daniel's transformation began with 5 minutes, but the real change happened when he understood what those 5 minutes were teaching him. He was learning to pause. He was learning to observe. He was learning to choose. And perhaps that is what you need to remember today. You may not be able to control every thought that enters your mind, but you can learn to control what you do with those thoughts. You may not be able to remove every fear, but you can become stronger than the fear. You may not be able to guarantee success, but you can guarantee that you will keep learning. So if your mind is tired, give it 5 quiet minutes. If your thoughts are loud, do not run from them. Sit with them, breathe through them, watch them pass. Then return to the present moment and take your next step. Because sometimes the biggest transformation in your life does not begin with a massive decision. Sometimes it begins with a quiet moment when you finally stop believing every negative thought your mind tells you. And years from now, when you look back at the person you became, you may realize that your entire future changed direction on the day you decided to give yourself just 5 minutes of peace. The world may never know how difficult that first step was. They may only see your confidence later. They may see your success. They may see your achievements and wonder how you became so strong. But you will know the truth. You will remember the fear. You will remember the doubt. You will remember the voice that once told you to stop. And you will remember the moment you finally answered it. Not with anger, not with panic, but with calm awareness. You will remember that you did not destroy your mind. You learned to understand it. You did not silence every negative thought. You learned not to obey every one. You did not become a different human being overnight. You simply became the person who could choose differently. One thought, one breath, one decision at a time. And that is how Daniel finally became stronger than his own mind. Not because the voice disappeared, but because it no longer had the power to decide where his life would go.